You never truly understand how delicate life is until one moment disrupts everything. What was intended to be a peaceful family getaway, a chance to reconnect in the serene mountains, quickly turned into something else entirely. It was Levi's idea. He always prioritized appearances, striving to present us as a picture-perfect family. Even though our marriage had long ceased being a romantic partnership and had become more of a practical arrangement. His son, Alexander, from a previous marriage, had always been distant, never fully accepting me as his stepmother. I agreed to the trip not out of excitement, but out of habit, a routine of going along to keep the peace. Yet peace was the one thing I didn't find that weekend. The problems began with a simple mix-up in the lodge reservations. Levi had mistakenly booked the wrong dates, leaving us one room short. He shrugged it off, casually suggesting that Alexander and I share a room for the night. As I lay in the dim light of that shared space, I couldn't ignore how fragile our family dynamic truly was. Looking back, I wonder if the cracks in our foundation were always there, waiting to give way, or if that night became the catalyst for everything unraveling. Either way, the fallout extended far beyond anything I could have anticipated. The drive to the lodge had been long and marked by silence, the kind born from a lack of connection. Levi focused on the road while I stared out the window, and Alexander sat in the back seat with his headphones on, engrossed in his phone. This was typical of our family trips, three people living parallel lives, never truly connecting. I broke the silence with a simple question about hiking boots, to which Levi replied curtly before turning his attention back to the road. Alexander rarely spoke, particularly around me. At 28, he carried a quiet intensity, his dark hair and sharp features serving as constant reminders of the woman Levi had loved before me. She had passed away during Alexander's teenage years, leaving a void that neither I nor Levi could fill. Despite this, the distance between Alexander and me was something neither of us attempted to bridge. When we arrived at the lodge, the setting sun bathed the mountains in a golden glow. The rustic charm of the lodge brought back memories of past trips, but the moment Levi returned from the front desk, his expression signaled trouble. "There's been a mix-up," he explained. "Only 2 rooms are available tonight. The third will be ready tomorrow." I understood immediately what this meant, and Levi confirmed it when he said, "You and Alexander will share a room." Although the idea unsettled me, I kept my discomfort to myself. Levi had already dismissed the situation as a minor inconvenience. The room Alexander and I shared was small but cozy, with a queen-sized bed and the faint scent of pine drifting through the open window. "This is cozy," Alexander remarked, his tone neutral as he set his bag down. Forcing a smile, I responded, "It's just for one night." I busied myself in the bathroom, trying to distract myself from the tension that seemed to fill the room. When night fell, Alexander offered me the bed, but I declined. "The bed's big enough for both of us," I said, and after a moment of hesitation, he agreed. As we lay on opposite sides, his quiet breathing was the only sound. I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, but deep down I knew better. That night, the stillness of the room and the soft chirping of crickets outside marked the beginning of something that would change everything. The shadows danced along the walls, creating an almost dreamlike atmosphere. Alexander lay on one side of the bed, scrolling through his phone, while I sat pretending to read a book. My thoughts, however, were elsewhere. Dinner earlier had been as quiet as most of our meals together. Levy animatedly shared stories about his work while Alexander and I politely nodded along, though neither of us was fully engaged. I couldn't quite pinpoint when the tension in our family began, but perhaps it had always been there, an unspoken undercurrent I chose to ignore. Now it was impossible to overlook. "You're not really reading that, are you?" Alexander suddenly broke the silence, pulling me from my thoughts. "What makes you say that?" I asked, feigning nonchalance. He smirked, setting his phone down. "You've been nodding for the last 20 minutes without turning a page." I laughed softly, embarrassed. His posture seemed more relaxed than usual, an unfamiliar ease settling between us. "What's on your mind?" he asked, catching me off guard. My response was hurried and vague, but his raised eyebrow revealed his skepticism. "Come on, Abigail, I know you better than that," he said, the sound of my name causing my chest to tighten. It wasn't the usual stepmom or polite quietness. It carried a tone that felt different, unsettling yet intimate. I exhaled deeply, leaning back against the headboard. "I was just thinking about how things used to be," I admitted. "Family trips used to feel enjoyable, didn't they?" "They did," Alexander replied, his expression softening. "At least when it was just my father and me, before I started seeing the cracks in everything." His words struck a chord, not because they were wrong, but because they were painfully accurate. "I've tried," I said quietly, "to make this work, to be someone you and your father could rely on." "I know," he said gently, surprising me. "Even if I don't always say it, I appreciate it." For the first time, the barriers between us seemed to dissolve. We spoke for hours, airing grievances about Levi and sharing memories of trips Alexander had taken with his mother. "She was the glue," he said, his tone tinged with longing. "My father worked all the time, but she made everything feel whole." "I can't compete with that," I confessed, my voice heavy with emotion. "You don't have to," he replied simply. A peaceful silence enveloped the room. I reached over to turn off the lamp, allowing the moonlight to fill the space. As I shifted, my leg brushed against his, and I quickly apologized, pulling away. "It's okay," he said softly. His voice was calm, but the moment felt charged. Each small movement seemed amplified, highlighting the closeness between us. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. "I'm fine," I lied, my throat dry. "You're always pretending," he said suddenly, his tone low. "Living as if everything's fine, fulfilling every role, but never feeling anything real." His words hit a nerve. Every day, I admitted. The vulnerability in the air was palpable, raw, and unfiltered. Then it happened, not dramatic or planned, but gradual. One moment we were talking in hushed voices, and the next, his fingers brushed mine. Neither of us pulled away. "Is this okay?" he murmured. I should have said no. I should have left. But instead, I turned toward him, my heart racing. "Yes," I whispered. When it was over, we lay in silence. My mind was a storm of guilt and confusion, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. "I'm sorry," Alexander said finally, his voice breaking the stillness. "Don't apologize," I replied quickly, my voice trembling. "It's fine." "I don't know what this means," he admitted. "Neither do I whispered, though deep down I did. The next morning, I woke before Alexander and slipped out of bed as quietly as possible. The soft dawn light cast a golden hue across the room. I dressed quickly, avoiding the mirror, and by the time Alexander stirred, I was sitting by the window, pretending to admire the mountain view. "Morning," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Morning," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. He hesitated, as though searching for the right words, but eventually nodded and disappeared into the bathroom. By the time we joined Levi in the dining room, the weight of the previous night lingered unspoken between us. At breakfast, the tension between Alexander and me was almost tangible, though Levi remained blissfully unaware. Alexander sipped his coffee, casually flipping through a newspaper and occasionally commenting on the weather or the day's plans. Yet, I could feel his gaze on me intense and searching. It took all my effort not to meet his eyes. I told myself the unease would fade, that the memory of the night before would eventually dissipate, and we'd fall back into routine. But as the day unfolded, it became increasingly clear some things, once done, can never be undone. The drive home from the lodge was marked by an uneasy silence. It wasn't the calm quiet I had hoped for, but one heavy with unspoken words and lingering thoughts. Levi, oblivious as ever, hummed cheerfully and tapped his fingers on the steering wheel while navigating the winding mountain roads. Alexander sat in the back seat, staring out the window, while I kept my eyes fixed ahead, my hands tightly folded in my lap. I tried to distract myself by focusing on the passing scenery, the rolling hills, dense forests, and the golden light filtering through the trees, but my thoughts relentlessly circled back to the previous night. Every detail was etched into my memory: Alexander's breathing, the brief touch of his hand against mine. It felt surreal, like a dream, yet the weight of its reality was undeniable. Stealing a glance at Alexander through the rearview mirror, I noticed his calm exterior belied the tension in his jaw, and the way his fingers gripped the armrest too tightly. We avoided looking at each other, though I couldn't tell if that avoidance was a relief or a punishment. When we finally pulled into the driveway, Levi stretched, already making plans. "I have a meeting in a couple of hours, but we should do something tonight, maybe dinner at that new Italian place," he said brightly. "Sure," I replied automatically, though the thought of a family dinner made my stomach churn. Alexander didn't respond. He simply grabbed his bag from the trunk and disappeared into the house without a word. The afternoon passed in a blur of chores. I folded laundry, cleaned the kitchen, and reorganized bookshelves, anything to keep myself occupied. But no matter how busy I stayed, my thoughts kept drifting back to Alexander. I replayed our conversation from the night before, his words about feeling lost and pretending to be someone he wasn't. I remembered the quiet understanding in his eyes, a connection I hadn't felt from anyone in years, not even Levi. The sound of footsteps on the stairs interrupted my thoughts. I turned to see Alexander standing in the doorway, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his jeans. "Hey," he said awkwardly. "Hey," I replied, my voice strained despite my efforts to sound composed. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the weight of unspoken thoughts hanging between us. He cleared his throat, glancing toward the kitchen. "I was just going to grab something to eat," he muttered. "Of course," I said, stepping aside to let him pass. As he brushed by me, even the brief contact left me breathless. I busied myself tidying the counter while he rummaged through the fridge, trying to ignore the way my heart raced with every movement he made. "About last night," he began hesitantly, his voice low. I gripped the dish towel tightly. "We don't have to talk about it," I interrupted quickly. "We can't just pretend it didn't happen," he said firmly. "Why not?" I countered, my voice sharper than intended. "That's exactly what we need to do. Pretend it never happened and move on." He stared at me, his expression unreadable. "Is that really what you want?" he asked quietly. "What I want doesn't matter," I replied, my voice trembling. "It can't happen again." "Why not?" he pressed. "Because it's wrong? Because it's inconvenient? Or because you're scared?" "Stop it," I snapped, turning away from him. He stepped closer, his voice soft now. "You don't have to pretend with me, Abigail. Not with me." "Please, Alexander," I whispered, my chest tightening. For a moment, I thought he might argue, but instead he sighed, stepping back and running a hand through his hair. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to make this harder for you." "It's already hard," I admitted, my voice barely audible. He nodded, his gaze lingering for a moment before he turned and left the room. That evening, Levi was his usual cheerful self, chatting about work and plans for the future. Alexander and I went through the motions, nodding and smiling at the right moments, though the tension between us was suffocating. At one point, Levi turned to Alexander, his tone curious. "You've been quiet today. Everything okay?" "Yeah," Alexander replied. Levi nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer, and resumed his meal. But I could feel Alexander's gaze on me, heavy and questioning. It took all my strength not to meet his eyes. Later that night, after Levi had gone to bed, I found myself pacing the living room, my thoughts spiraling. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine, not when it so clearly wasn't. Alexander's voice startled me from my thoughts. "Can't sleep?" he asked quietly, standing in the doorway with a cautious expression. I turned to see him step into the room, his hands buried in his pockets. We stood there in silence, the unspoken tension thickening with every passing second. "I don't know what to do," I finally admitted, my voice trembling. "Neither do I," he confessed, his gaze falling to the floor. "But I know I don't want to lose you." His words hit me like a blow and my chest tightened. "Alexander, we can't," I began, but he interrupted, his voice raw with emotion. "That doesn't mean I can just ignore what I feel. Not when it comes to you." Tears stung my eyes as I shook my head. "This isn't fair to any of us." "I know," he said, his voice breaking. "I just needed to hear you say it." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, running a hand through his hair, he said quietly, "I'm going for a walk." "Be careful," I whispered, though the words felt hollow. He nodded and left, leaving me alone with my spiraling thoughts. That night, as Levi slept soundly beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, feeling trapped in a cage of my own making, one I couldn't escape. The next morning, Alexander was gone. I found a note on the kitchen counter, written in his messy handwriting. I need some time to clear my head. Don't worry about me. I'll be fine, but I need to figure this out on my own. The words cut through me, and I gripped the note, my hands trembling as panic set in. "What's that?" Levi asked, walking into the kitchen with his phone in hand. "Alexander's left," I said faintly, my voice trailing off. Levi frowned, taking the note from my hand. "What does that mean? Where did he go?" "I don't know," I replied, tears brimming in my eyes. Levi sighed, rubbing a hand through his hair. "That boy never thinks things through. He's probably sulking." His dismissive tone made my blood boil. "This isn't sulking, Levi. He's upset." "Well, what do you expect me to do about it?" he snapped. "He's an adult. If he wants to act like a child, that's his problem." I stared at him, stunned by his indifference. "You really don't care, do you?" "Of course I care," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "But I'm not chasing after him. He needs to grow up and handle his own problems." I turned away, trying to steady my breathing as the weight of everything pressed down on me. The days that followed were agonizing. I spent every moment wondering where Alexander was, if he was safe, and whether he would come back. I called his phone repeatedly, but it went straight to voicemail. I considered driving around to look for him, but I didn't know where to begin. One evening, as I sat in the living room staring blankly at my phone, Levi seemed unconcerned, going about his day as if nothing had changed. When my friend Luna called, her voice was filled with concern. "I haven't heard from you in a while," she said. "Is everything okay?" I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "It's complicated," I said finally. "Complicated how?" she pressed. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "Alexander left. He didn't say where he was going or when he'd be back." "Did something happen?" she asked sharply. "It's just been tense lately," I replied, dodging the full truth. "Ah-ha," Luna said, clearly unconvinced. "Well, if you need to talk, you know where to find me." "Thanks," I said quietly, though I wasn't sure I meant it. "Thanks," I said quietly, though I wasn't sure I meant it. After hanging up, I sat for a long time, staring at the empty space where Alexander used to be. The house felt unbearably empty without him. I replayed our last conversation over and over, his raw vulnerability etched into my memory. I thought about his question, the one I hadn't answered honestly. "Was it just a mistake to you?" I didn't know. Maybe it was. Or maybe it was something more, something I wasn't ready to admit. All I knew was that I missed him, and that thought terrified me more than anything. The emptiness Alexander left behind was suffocating. Days turned into weeks, and the silence in the house grew heavier with every passing moment. Levi continued as if everything was perfectly normal, immersing himself in work and dismissing any mention of Alexander with a wave of his hand. "He'll be fine," he repeated more than once. "He always is." But I wasn't fine, and I couldn't shake the uncertainty about Alexander either. Some afternoons I found myself driving aimlessly, scanning streets and cafes, clinging to the faint hope of catching a glimpse of him. I obsessively checked his social media, but it was as though he had vanished. His absence felt like a void, and I couldn't help but blame myself. The note he left was brief, almost indifferent, but its timing haunted me. I kept asking myself, what did I do to him? The question pressed down on me, unrelenting. No matter how much I tried to distract myself, it lingered. One Thursday evening, while Levi was out for a dinner meeting, I wandered aimlessly through the house. Without realizing it, I ended up in Alexander's room. The faint scent of him still lingered, wrapping around me like a memory I couldn't escape. I sat on the edge of his bed, my fingers tracing the quilt as my eyes drifted to his desk. A stack of papers caught my attention, messily piled in the corner. I told myself not to snoop, but my curiosity overpowered me. Riffling through the stack, I found a letter. It wasn't addressed to me, but I knew instantly it was about me. Dear Abigail, I don't know how to say this. I can't seem to articulate it aloud, so I'm putting it in writing instead. I hope you never read this, but if you do, I hope it helps you understand. I can't stop thinking about you, about us, about that night. I know it was wrong, and I know it probably meant nothing to you, but to me, it meant everything. You make me feel seen, like I'm not just a failure or a disappointment. You make me feel important, and I don't know how to handle that. I've tried to let it go, but I can't. I think that's why I have to leave. I'm sorry if I've made things harder. That was never my intention. But I can't stay here not like this. Take care of yourself, Abigail. Always. Alexander. I read the letter 3 times, and each time the weight of it grew heavier. My hands trembled as I set it down, overwhelmed by a storm of emotions I couldn't untangle. He had left because of me, because of what happened and how I'd responded or failed to respond. Instead of relief at his absence, I felt an aching emptiness that threatened to swallow me whole. Levi came home late that night, his tie loosened and the smell of whiskey clinging to him. He dropped his briefcase by the door and headed to the kitchen, pouring himself another drink. Clutching the letter, I followed him. Levi, I began, my voice shaking. He turned, his expression weary. What is it, Abigail? I need to talk to you, I said, tightening my grip on the letter. He sighed, setting his glass down. Can it wait? I've had a long day. No, it can't wait, I said firmly, surprising even myself. He frowned, crossing his arms. I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. Instead of speaking, I handed him the letter. What's this? He asked, taking it. Just read it, I whispered. His eyes scanned the letter, confusion morphing into anger, then something darker. Who the hell is this? He demanded, his voice low and sharp. It's from Alexander, I murmured. No kidding, he snapped, holding up the letter. What does he mean by this? What happened, Abigail? I felt the weight of his anger suffocating me. I didn't mean for this to happen, I said, tears streaming down my face. This was a mistake, he spat, his voice laced with venom. Is that what you're calling it, a mistake? I couldn't answer. The burden of his fury was crushing. Without another word, Levi stormed out, slamming the door so hard the house seemed to shake. I sank to the kitchen floor, clutching the letter as tears flowed uncontrollably. I wanted to scream, to cry, to run away and never come back, but I couldn't move. The next morning, I forced myself to get up. The house was unnervingly silent. the absence of both Levi and Alexander creating a suffocating gloom that I couldn't escape.